post-high school or college job, you went right to writing full-time, right?
I did have a couple of jobs after high school, mostly bookstores, used bookstores, and so on. I worked at Mithras Unicorn, a legendary theater in La Jolla, uh,
Mhm.
for a while, and that was one of my last jobs. So I think the last job I had, salaried job, was in 1975 or 76.
So do you think that was a good or a bad thing as far as life experience and becoming a novelist?
Well, shortly thereafter, I'd had a lot of life experience because I was a Navy brat.
Right.
So I'd already been acquainted with a lot of different people and positions and so on. And you know, it's interesting to think of what the difference would be if I was actually working in a job. But I had enough imagination that I could take those people and fold them into my novels and make them more effective.
Okay. I don't think I've ever asked you. I was always curious. A lot of people I know who are married and their spouses are writers like Astrid is, or just they're smart people. Some of them are very keen to have their spouses be their first editor, and some never let it happen because then they fight about it. So I was curious how you guys do it.
She is my first reader by all means. She's very good at it. And in fact, our daughter has become a copy editor, not an editorial editor, however. And
Oh,
so,
really?
you know, also, if I look back on I don't think Pohl made Astrid into, Paul Anderson made Astrid into his first reader, but uh, but I certainly am happy to.
So does Erica read your work, or is she actually being a commercially full-time copy editor now?
No, Alex was the one who read my books. Chloe is uh, is employed otherwise and doesn't get to read my books before they're published.
Oh, okay. I wasn't quite clear about that.
But she did help with Mongoliad, of course, and under the pseudonym of Erik Bear, she's on the Mongoliad list of one of the 7 authors that put that together.
Yeah, I have trouble keeping that list straight. I still remember meeting Cooper Moo and asking what his real name was because I just couldn't picture a guy named Moo, but he really is.
Yep.
He was one of the
Well,
first guys I
well,
actually thought about asking for a driver's license. You told me he'd go into bookstores and occasionally they card you.
well, Cooper was one of our major writers on this whole thing, and he worked with Chloe on their section of the Mongoliad.
So, what do you think you gained from being a Navy brat? It was Navy, right?
Yeah, yeah. My father was an enlisted man and then an officer in the Navy, and he basically took us all over the world, at least in Asia. And we got to Japan. That was my first memory, was in Japan as a 2-year-old, and then to the Philippines. But also in between, we got off to Texas and Rhode Island and all sorts of places. And so I got to see a lot of geology, a lot of geography, and a lot of territory by the time I was 5 years old. And when we ended up in the Philippines, suddenly we were in a major tropical country, and I could look at you know, the olive green clouds of the monsoon season, and the nipa huts, the huts on stilts that were uh, where the villagers lived, and all that stuff. And I'm working on that my memoirs now and recording a lot of that stuff. And it was a fascinating time period. But also that was in the early days what would become the Vietnam War.
Oh, I didn't realize it was that period. I didn't track the whole thing specifically. Hang on, my stupid phone is not cooperating. Um, so you were born in San Diego and ended up back in San Diego for most of your later childhood, I guess you'd say,
After
or
the age of
teen.
12, my father was out of the Navy and we did not get shipped all over the world. But I did get back with the help of my friend David Clark and his father. I managed to get to Spain, and that was the first of my trips to Europe. I never went to Europe as a Navy brat.
Oh, well, you'd be surprised, I guess, where Navy folks and people in the Army can go to bases almost everywhere. When you were going around the world, was it pretty much still pro-Americana, or did you feel the first wave of the anti-American growth of sentiment?
Well, our first tour of duty was in Japan, and Japan was post-war and just post-occupation, and so there were communists in Japan that were quite vigorous and violent. And I remember my father telling a story of our driving in our road to Soto in Japan down a highway, passing a parade of communists who were basically protesting, and they were barefoot. And one of them just reached out and kicked as hard as he could with his foot and left a dent in our DeSoto door, which you can imagine. An old DeSoto, that's got to be, but that was part of the reaction. But also, we had a lot of great response from our friends, and my father made friends with our first landlord in Japan, who, when we had a house outside of the base, and this landlord had been a former officer in the Japanese military, I'm not sure which branch. And we have a good picture of him in his kimono sitting there sipping scotch or whiskey with my father. And I wonder what they were talking about, because Dad was an enlisted man at that point, and this guy was a probably a very high level, had been a very high level Japanese officer. And to be a fly on the wall in that conversation would be fabulous.
So your dad was a Mustang?
Yes.
That's a fairly rare thing, isn't it?
Well, if you're going to become an officer, you really can't be an officer of higher rank like captain or admiral without having a degree or being put in the Naval Academy. My dad never went to the Naval Academy, but he worked his way through the ranks and ended up as a lieutenant commander when he retired.
Oh, geez. That's pretty impressive. The highest one I think I've ever met was my friend Rob was a Navy brat like you, and his dad went all over the world. But I think by the time Rob was born, for him, they'd settled in Puget Sound. His dad was retired.
Uh-huh.
And I remember his dad was the exec on the submarine with the guy who wrote Run Silent, Run Deep.
Oh, of course, one of the greats.
I wouldn't have wanted to be in that situation. Not that I fit into submarines that well either. You're not that short either.
You're a little taller than I am, but we've been aboard a lot of submarines, including U-boats and so on in museums. And I got to say, I'm a little claustrophobic in some submarines. We did enjoy visiting the museum in Oregon, which has OMSI, which has an old pre-nuclear war, a George Washington style submarine. And that's an interesting experience.
Yeah, those things were tiny. I used to go down the waterfront in Seattle when they were in town and look at the ships. My friend Bruce sadly passed away, but I don't go down anymore. And he'd take me and we'd go wander on carriers, and we'd get to see. He talked to guys in the show and some of the stuff they weren't supposed to. And I almost got kicked out of the captain's chair on the one carrier, but luckily I stood to the side before the officer burst in looking to kill people because we weren't supposed to be up in there.
Well, I've been on board.
I kind of regret not sitting in though, because never got around to it because he chucked us out.
That's right. I've been on board the aircraft carriers my father served on and my uncle Dick served on, in Ticonderoga and Oriskany. The Oriskany has now been sunk, and you can watch that on YouTube, which kind of is a disturbing thing for anyone who's been aboard the carrier. But my father's tour of duty on the Oriskany was pretty substantial, and it wore him out, and he retired shortly thereafter. Not because of the tour of duty, but that was Vietnam. And making weather forecasts for people who were going in to bomb Vietnam. And
yeah, that wouldn't have been a lot of fun probably, because you get it wrong, it could be very bad.
It could be, and he had some interesting experiences there. But
so
those stories that he told us about, not just that, but about being in World War II on the island of Tinian in the Marianas. That really strongly influenced my work on war dogs, and having that nautical background, having traveled across the Pacific from the Philippines by boat in an old military transport ship, which was really quite luxurious in terms of accommodations, but rolled like a son of a bitch. That was an interesting experience, and I put all of that into my stories. In fact, I took the rolling boat and put it into Dinosaur Summer.
Yeah, so I remember when you told me a little bit about how you were in San Diego again when you were a teen and preteen. You had either founded or joined a club of likewise science fiction fans. You started connecting to local authors. How old were you when did you start the club, or when did the club begin?
Well, we had a film club that we were kind of putting together to make a movie. We wanted to do a version of A Sound of Thunder, and a bunch of us got together, and I wrote a short script, and our friend David Clark said that Ray Bradbury is going to be giving a talk at the auditorium nearby. And so we went to that talk, and we crept up as he was finishing his talk and snuck out before the crowd got out and got to get together with him, meet him outside. And he looked at us and he seemed to kind of understand us. And we were a bunch of enthusiasts, and we, talked with him for a little bit, and he signed my books. And there was another person there, and this kind of completes the triangle of my interests here, which was Phil Tippett. Phil Tippett wanted to become an Oscar award-winning special effects artist, and he was already doing magnificent work at that time period on their version of A Sound of Thunder. So there were two of us in the area who wanted to make A Sound of Thunder. Turns out that Bill Stromberg and Phil Tippett actually finished their version. We did not. We were just 16, 17, actually 16 years old, and we never had the discipline to actually begin filming and start, but which we had, good intentions. And so that was where our group began to get together. I had met many of the people who would become part of what would become the first committee for San Diego Comic-Con in the 1960s at Horseman High School, junior high school. And also ran into them later at my high school, Pershing High School, after we got back from Kodiak. Roger Friedman was at Pershing. Scott Shaw ended up at Crawford, along with David Clark and me and John Pound. And I think Roger was there for a while too. And we all enjoyed each other, and we enjoyed talking about science fiction and comics and everything that was going on then in movies. And so I was doing comic art at that point and writing, and David Clark was doing comic scripting, and Scott Shaw, of course, was doing comics. He became a very famous cartoonist, and Roger Friedman was doing physics. So we had quite a group of people there, and they became the core, one of the cores of what became San Diego Comic-Con. The other cores were our older fans who helped us understand what it was like to run a convention.
Yeah, I wish we'd known each other back then. I really, of all the people in the business I haven't met, one of the ones I really wanted to meet was Jack Kirby.
Yeah, well, guess what? We did.
Yeah.
We invited Jack to join our Comic-Con, which was called Golden State Comic-Con at that point. And we invited Ray Bradbury to join our Comic-Con. And we actually got Ray to waive his speaking fee, which was really unusual. And then Ray came to every single Comic-Con thereafter. He really loved it. And eventually, Ray Harryhausen joined him, and they were quite a duo. And but with Jack Kirby and Ray Bradbury, I think we had the beginning, the core of what would become the enthusiasm that would become Comic-Con.
How many folks came the first year?
200, huge.
Okay.
We were in the basement of the U.S. Grant Hotel, which had not yet been renovated. So it was an interesting place to be. But fandom ended up in some interesting seedy hotels, including the Claremont, which is now very fancy. And science fiction really kind of has to attach itself to older hotels for some reason to really get started.
I remember, do you ever hear Terry Pratchett tell the story about his first ever, I get it mixed up, there's DisCon and Disclave, one US, one English one, and he was trying to get the first English one started, and they asked him to call the hotel manager because they couldn't get him to agree to it.
Yeah.
So Terry convinced them it would be a nice crowd and they wouldn't be like burning down the hotel and everything, those crazy science fiction people as compared to Shriners and stuff, which are so much more reputable.
Absolutely, yeah, classic.
So at the time the con was ending, the manager walks over to Terry and says, and God bless you, Mr. Pratchett, this was a wonderful convention. You can come back here anytime you want. And he said, I love your fans. They drink like the rugby club, but they fight like the chess club.
Well, early conventions was WesterCon in San Diego. That was 1966. And that was actually the first convention I attended briefly. I didn't realize you could stick around. So I was only there for 20 minutes. But that was legendary because the hotel managers were very disappointed by the response of science fiction fans to the local professionals who worked the hotel. They brought their own women and men to the whole convention. And, and the hotel was not at all happy with that. That was known as the Stardust Con or Bouncing Potatoes Convention. And I was only there for 20 minutes. But, my first convention thereafter was BayCon, which was at the Claremont. And that was quite extraordinary. There was so many wonderful people there.
Well, I was thinking about the fact that I've had discussions with various people in the genre over the years that writers, more than say other professionals, tend to be a lot more supportive and helpful to people who are basically, they're training their own competition in a lot of ways.
Right.
And science fiction seems to me to be the genre that's the most supportive. And I thought I was being really clever once. I ran into Harry Trolldove when he was leaving the Hugo ceremony one year. And we just met Harry's daughters earlier that year, and all three of them had won regional or national honors for the young writing contests.
Ooh.
And I said to Harry, it's great that we're a supportive field. Science fiction is so friendly and helpful and all, but isn't raising your own competition a bit much? And without missing a beat, Harry turned around and said, if Mike Resnick can do it, so can I.
Well, Harry's are greats. And, I quite agree. But, it's because I think science fiction fans aren't actually smart enough economically to realize that they're creating a competition. Instead, they see it as a non-zero-sum game. And that's an interesting perspective, is if the community prospers, all of us prosper, rising tide and all that stuff.
Well, it's been sure. I keep waiting for what I consider the third or fourth wave. We had the Star Trek wave that buoyed the field. We had Star Wars to some degree, but I have not seen, in my recollection or knowledge, another wave since then that has really expanded the field like that.
I think we have. It's the diversity wave. We've got so many people brought in part by writers like Octavia Butler and so on. So many people who realize that they can write in this field and be supported. And so Clarion has stepped forward and helped them. And Clarion has become very, very diverse now, not just by teachers, but in staff and clientele. And so that's an interesting change. I think that's the next wave. I'm not sure that the analog wave quite recognizes that wave yet, but it's there. And, if we talk about Steve Barnes and Tananarive Dew and Andrea Hairston and N.K. Jameson and all the others who are moving in and really doing great in their careers. And Nala Hopkinson just became our Grand Master. So it's a very diverse field now, and I think that's our next wave.
I hope that's true. That's a good thought. So I just need to clean my phone up, but it rang while I was trying to. Okay, so talk about your artwork, because I remember once being at your house and thinking, what the hell was this gorgeous painting on the wall? And you told me you had been doing a Bradbury calendar, but the project never went through. And I've always wanted to see the whole thing done, and curious about if you still use that as something to like clear your head, or how much artwork you do.
I don't do a lot of artwork nowadays. Most it's writing. I kind of stopped my artwork back in the late 1970s, and only did a couple thereafter. I've got a Bradbury piece I'm quite proud of, but a lot of the paintings I did for one of the paintings I did for the Bradbury calendar is not to my satisfaction. Another, unfortunately, has some deterioration. So that may not come about, but I do have good photos of all of them, and I do send them off to the Bradbury University exhibitions and all that kind of stuff. And so that's been very interesting, is having my paintings displayed in museums.
Well, I'll be really curious to see. I don't know if you can talk much about the next book, the memoir, because one thing I think about is that I tried to get FM Busby years ago to write his memoirs, because Buzz had a bloody photographic memory, and he could tell me stories from first fandom that just fried my hair. I just was shocked at the stuff he knew and could remember.
Cool.
And I don't, unfortunately, have that skill. But also, the late great David Harrell once pulled out a shoebox of letters and dumped it out, and I was like, "Who is that?" He's like, "Oh, that's Harlan Ellison as a teenager." I was just going, "What?" And there's all these pictures of all these people that I either had met or knew of, and they were punk kids or just in their first, they just gotten married and brought the spouse or whatever. There's what was it? Not Cyril Cornbluth. Some Judith Merrill, I think, was in the pictures. And I was just going, and the books, those never got collected into a book. I'd like to see some more stuff like that in the field.
Well, there's a lot of university
collections.
Judith Merrill has a Canadian university connection, and I am associated with San Diego State University. And I think San Diego State is trying to collect the Comic-Con papers, but I'm not sure whether they have them yet or not. There's lots of history here, and Gregory Benford made a good suggestion. He says, if you publish your autobiography, you should have pictures in it. And I realized, okay, if you do electronic publishing, that's perfectly possible. but if you're going to do a book, what are you going to do for?
It's hard.
It's harder. But we've got dozens of pictures, and we've got the pictures that J.K. Klein took, which he donated to University of California at Riverside or Irvine? Riverside. Pardon? Riverside. And that collection, you can see it online, and it's fabulous. And people are still trying to identify all the people. I found F.M. Busby in those photographs. I also found, of course, famous writers who were there at BayCon in 1968, including John Brunner and Beecher Trimble, a famous fan who had saved Star Trek at that point. John W. Campbell Jr., I first met him there. And the Benford twins were there, and there's just all kinds of interesting connections through those.
Sorry, the Benford twins?
Yeah, he's a what do they call it, stereometric or mirror twin. I believe he's a mirror twin to James Benford. And
okay, so it's fraternal or stereometric. He's not an identical twin. Okay.
No, he's identical. He was.
Oh, he is.
The different lifestyles and raising makes them look different, but you can recognize that Benford and the two Benfords, I know them apart, but some people might not.
I haven't seen Greg in far too long, and I was thinking about the fact that it's not quite a collaboration, but to some degree, you and Greg and David became the Killer Bees, and I was curious you could talk a little about how the whole foundation thing came about.
Well, that was Greg's idea, actually, and he went to Asimov's widow and suggested that, and she agreed, and so gave us good terms. So we worked with the publisher, and basically we knew we had enough discipline not to interfere with each other. And we took different areas of our story and worked on it. And Benford was the first. I was the second with Foundation and Chaos. And I decided I really wanted to work in the universe as I defined by Asimov. David Brin read off and connected all of Asimov's universes together, which was what Asimov was doing at that point before he died. And, that was an interesting experiment, but they became very popular, and it was great fun. And in a sense, I was taking over a franchise in the same way I'd taken over, and to some extent worked in Star Trek and what would later work in Star Wars, and then, of course, Halo. So I was basically doing all the franchises except maybe Richie Rich, which I haven't been invited.
I think that'd be really the right thing for you. You guys never did another project together? You never really thought about doing another?
No, Benford has edited some anthologies, and I've contributed some stories and stuff. No, we never worked together on a collection.
How did you get involved in Mongolia? Because as far as I recall, that started out as a sword fighting club, and then it sprawled into a whole universe of things.
Well, I got to blame Neil Stevenson for that. He really wanted to create a disciplined sword fighting exercise club in which you do, practice with swords in the afternoon and then go get pastries, and then or go right upstairs and then go get pastries. And there were enough writers, would-be writers in our group that we could do that. So Chloe was there with me, and there was 5 or 6 others. And between Neil's connection and all the stuff that we were doing, we were perfectly set up for that. So we started writing. And eventually we had like 500 pages, which we decided to release online at first. And eventually we found a publisher, it was Amazon, and they published it, and they trained their staff on these books and promoted them hugely. And so it was very successful. It sold quite well and still is selling.
I have very fond memories of the night we did the first event, but I discovered what it really meant to herd cats when I was trying to control autograph signing of 7 authors and an illustrator all at once. That was a little bit more than I was ready for.
That was fun, wasn't it?
But you guys wrote mostly discrete sections, right? Really, it wasn't like, some of these guys write, like Brian and Kevin, for example, are doing the Dune worlds, and they go back and forth every chapter or so, or they write different types of scenes. You were mostly writing your own chunk?
Yeah, every one of us was assigned a kind of a specific territory. Some of us had the Mongolian sections, and some of us had the European sections. And there was a lot of history buffs here. Mark Teppel was a major history buff, as was Neil, and so am I. And we would assign out different tasks to do. And then they would do the research and they would write the sections. And then we would get together and revise them and coordinate them. And Mark and I did most of that and make them work. And then the different books would get published. first online, but later by Amazon. And
Yeah.
so
Well,
that was an
we probably
interesting
should talk
story.
about your new book that just came out last week. I'm sorry we didn't do the event last week, but I was a little preoccupied that day, and so we're doing it today. Talk about the Unfinished Land and how you have gone back to, I wouldn't really call it high fantasy. It's a different flavor.
It's historical fantasy, but it starts off with a survivor of the Spanish Armada, an English fisher boy who is drifting north on the currents and after the battle of Gravelines, and his experiences, he's pretty sure he's going to die, but then a Spanish galleon comes alongside. It's severely damaged. It's drifting without a rudder. Basically, they're caught going north, and the galleon pulls them ashore, pulls them aboard because of the pleading of an old man whose name is Manuel. And Manuel, turns out, is going home. Manuel is heading north to the island of Tirnanog, one of the 7 islands at the top of the world where history and myth begin. In the Mystery Isles, you got these different forces that are combining to create our history, which is not finished yet. So Europe has just had a major disaster, and it doesn't look good. But you know, our young man Reynard and Manuel survive the shipwreck on the Tirnanog and head inland and find amazing things there. They find the secret of creation. The secret of creation is that there are monsters that came from the stars who didn't have language but had every other power. And the travelers, the traveling tinkerers, taught them language. And that language became the language they could fix history with. And so that's where Reynard finds himself, and he finds that he's actually uniquely qualified for all of this. His parents lived in a village on the coast of England, and his uncle died on the shipwreck that he was surviving on. And so there's a lot of history here, but also this becomes the origin story for both history and for myth and fantasy. And that's what I'm allowing my subconscious to do. I basically gave it free rein to write this book, and I'm not sure I could write this book again. I think the subconscious is the mythic subconscious is fully in charge of what goes on in this book.
Well, I mean, not in style, because your style has always been its own, but it raised some mental triggers or recollections of how much one of my favorite works of all time is Jack Vance's Lioness trilogy, which is in the
Yeah,
Elder Isle.
yeah,
And yours is got some of the same sort of mythic reverence in it, and I
yeah.
like that a lot.
Well, you know, a lot of my mentors are people like Paul Anderson and Jack Vance, and but also, you know, there's a whole history of myth, including James Branch Cabell and E.R.R. Edison, and all of that stuff, rich with language that I just find fascinating and have always enjoyed, and I try to incorporate some of that in this book. Also, this book, I think, uses mostly accurately, I certainly hope so, the Elizabethan dialect, which actually went away about 30 years, 40 years after this book takes place in the 1620s. It becomes Jacobean dialect, and that's a different thing.
Yeah, I remember reading 1602 when it came out. I could not figure why Neil picked the year until I realized what the heck actually happened in 1601, 1602. Then I knew exactly why he picked that year, because that was a seismic shift in English royal history, shall we say.
Absolutely.
And I just, okay, so I lost the question I was going to come out of my mind there. Sorry. Oh yeah, so I remember the first time I was at a group and somebody asked you, and they assumed you were a physicist or a biochemist, and they asked what your degree is, and the answer made me laugh. Not because it's a bad degree, because it wasn't the one I was expecting. That you have a degree in English.
That's it. I don't have anything, you know, actually my editor, Jim Frinkle, back in the 80s asked what's your degree, and he had published Eon. And he says, you have a degree in physics? I says, no, I don't. I'm an English major. And so I've lived off of that for buying drinks for years. You know, the whole thing about physics is that you can learn them on your own as long as you don't have to take classes and grades. And I did. And I also learned biology later on. So I've got a lot of, in fact, I've been invited to speak at biological conferences, some of them pretty major, including the American Philosophical Society, where I was on a panel with some amazing world-class virologists. And
I can't remember if you coined sorry.
Pardon?
If you coined the term, but I remember thinking about we talked once about the physics, and I believe I made you crazy when I explained that I was applying Clark's law to Eon, where I didn't understand the science in it, but because I just didn't have enough grasp of the higher end physics. But you've always tried to have the part where here's the physics that the layman will know,
Right.
and here's the physics that the people in the field will know, and here's the part where I'm pushing it past the boundary of what anybody on the whole planet knows. And I think we called it fuzzy logic or something like that, or fuzzy physics. And I was just
Fuzzy math.
curious, how much does that take to keep going properly? And who do
Well,
you
you know,
test it on?
I've had some terrific physicists who are readers of mine, including Marvin Minsky, and there's just a whole group of people who read my stuff and were not offended by it, but were intrigued by it. And I thought that was the level I needed to be at. Is if I can convince a physicist that I'm not a complete idiot and gives them some ideas for where to go next, that's all I need to do. That's all a good science fiction writer needs to do.
It all depends on your field. I remember I was watching, oh God, The Devil Wears Prada. I had not read the book, but I was watching the movie. And there's a certain point in the film where my friend looked at me and we liked him. We burst out into silent laughter because we were booksellers. And there's just no way in creation this one would have gotten the advanced Harry Potter book for her boss's kid. It just wouldn't happen. And we just lost some believability in the film at that point. And I remember John Kramer, who I've not seen in a while, I hope he's doing well, telling me how he'd taken a book we'd both read and he'd thrown it across the room in irritation. And I was like, why? It was a fun book. It seemed, he said they lost control of the basic rules of physics. Where? I said, he said, the part where the satellites orbiting the planet. I said, well, that works. Geocentric orbit works. He said, not over North America. I went, oh, right. It's got to be over the equator. But I had forgotten that part when reading the book, and so it went past me. But the author should have caught that, or his copyrighter should have caught that. And that made all the scientists that read the book go, well, those key things have to be in a book that has science in it.
Yeah, it's kind of dangerous to deal in someone's expertise, especially when you're playing around with it. But you know, I've had pretty good luck with that. My physics, I generally know enough to get the facts basically right, maybe even more than basically right. But I don't belabor the reader with most of them. Now, they just have to be background like everything else in the book. There's a cultural background, there's a linguistic background, there's character background, and then you've got the physics background. But also, if you're working with biology, I actually read a lot of biological texts and textbooks and articles and created my own compendium, which went into Darwin's Radio. And that got me a lot of drinks. You know, basically, if you get together with biologists and they think you know what you're talking about, it's great fun. But one of the fun things I had was meeting with biologists here in Seattle area and finding out that in some cases they were telling me that stuff was going on that in fact was not accurate. So I was able to correct some biologists, which, you know, fortunately, I had enough expert help to help me correct my mistakes before the book got published by and large. But, you know, going through that whole period was an amazing period. And that was when we were about to discover and finalize the Human Genome Project. And boy, was that a fertile time period.
Yeah, I keep waiting for the part where I can go into my doctors and say, yeah, I'd like to have a sheep grow me a new kidney or something. I don't need to see a new mouse or a new rabbit. I want to see new parts from my body. I want to be able to replace my parts. And they should be able to do that pretty bloody soon, I would think.
Well, they just cloned a ferret, I believe it is, Blackfoot ferret.
Yeah.
And that's pretty astonishing. So they're doing a lot of amazing stuff. But, you know, we go back to the early days when I was kind of beginning my studies, and that was Dolly the Sheep. And Dolly the Sheep, unfortunately, died early of aging. You know, that was an interesting lesson. So they learned a lot about cloning and about that sort of stuff. And I hope this ferret does better.
Well, I was thinking about it right now because my mom's about to go have foot surgery and her foot's totally screwed up. And if they could just, you know, replace it with a biological one, that would be a lot simpler.
Yeah, either that or tell the foot to repair itself. I don't know. There's a lot of science fictional ideas where there's also transplants, there's Frankenstein, there's all these usual things we talk about. But, you know, whatever works.
Blood Music gave me the creeps years ago when I read that book. It's very pulse pounding, but the ending made me just sort of go, no, no, I don't want to end up like that.
You know, Bruce Sterling had a totally different response. He says, oh, wow, I want that. When can I get that now? You know, likes his transformations.
They were running cable, and I was watching the William Shatner episode where he's the beast, whatever it's called, the one where he's the guy in the plane and the monster's out there ripping the engine apart, and everyone thinks he's just a crazy, and they don't
Yeah,
believe him. Science fiction has done an awesome job over the years of looking at things from the altered view. I miss our buddy Alan Norris. He used to write some really crackerjack stuff.
yeah, he
I
was.
always wanted to see Blade Runner.
Well,
His Blade Runner made into a
his
movie.
version of Blade Runner was actually bought by trying to think of William Burroughs. William Burroughs bought his version of Blade Runner, and so when Ridley Scott wanted to take the title Blade Runner for their their movie, he had to go to William Burroughs, and William Burroughs sold it to him. But that's the provenance of the Alan Norris Blade Runners, is sold it to Ridley Scott.
Well, it's a strange world. Speaking of film projects, anything new on your TV or film world coming up anytime?
No, I made a reacquaintance with one of my favorites, which is Louis John Carlino. He died a few months ago. His daughter came to us and said he's got a script. He's still working on that script when he died. And so I told her, okay, why don't you do it, finish it off, and we'll see what happens. And she's trying to take it around now. That was actually a very good script, and her changes to it were also very good. So we have some hope for that, but we do not know. Hollywood is in a mess right now.
Well, I mean, local theater is still closed up by me in Northgate here. They aren't open. Some of the restaurants are barely open. The theater here, I think it's decided it's not worth the attendance. What script were we talking about for your work clothes? Sorry.
Pardon? He worked
What
on
script does she?
Louis
Sorry,
John
go again.
worked on Blood Music back around 1990, 1991.
Oh, Blood Music. Well, the technology. I think you followed as much side of the 10 years of Spider-Man fight when James Cameron got interested and everybody was suing everybody over that. And Marvel had sold all this stuff off in chunks to everybody, and everybody sued everybody. But by the time they finally made the first Spider-Man film, the technology was so much more advanced. It was
absolutely.
Because I remember the terrible TV show. So,
well,
maybe
we met James Cameron and worked with him for a couple of days. He's an interesting and really talented fellow. Still working on Avatar. Apparently, he's not interested in doing any films but Avatar. And he had some interesting observances about getting films made. And I learned a lot from him and from our other people in the room at that point. It is a really hard job.
No, it's a book publishing and book selling is a weird business, but in Hollywood where I think they buy about 9 times what they make or more. 10% gets made or something. That's strange.
Well,
we're still waiting for Dune to come out. The new Dune is supposed to be pretty good, but it hasn't made it out yet.
Well, I actually like the 80s Dune, but it's like, a Russian art film in some respects. So I'd like to see this new one. It looks very good indeed. And I'm a big fan of the books. In fact, when I was 16 years old and reading the paperback of Dune, I imagined this scene, which would be, probably in some movie or another. And Jessica and her son, Paul, are traveling across a sand dune and climb onto a rock ridge. And all of a sudden you hear this shushing sound behind them and all around. The shushing sound completely fills the theater. And then just beyond their heads, what they can't see, they don't see this huge sandworm rising up and just not saying a thing, and then slowly slips back down, and the sand closes over it, and they never even knew it was there. That would be my version of Dune.
Well, I thought the Sci-Fi Channel miniseries was done fairly well.
Pretty
The
good
movie,
too, yeah.
I talked to a friend whose friend was like assistant cinematographer on the one from the 80s, the De Laurentiis. He said part of the problem was they'd shot the equivalent of like 100 hours of film, and they couldn't condense it into a film that made any sense. There's scenes that just make no sense at all if you haven't read the book, because there's no correlation. Why are they killing the Emperor's planetologist, and why is this happening?
Yeah,
and
well,
the visuals are great. The cast is amazing, but
the cast is amazing. The visuals are one of my favorites, and I'm wondering if they can. It looks like the new one is really stylish too, so let's hope so.
I always wanted to see Eon. I always wanted to see, was it the stone arrive in orbit? That would have been one of my favorite scenes.
Well, we've got a nice gentleman who is working as a possible showrunner if Eon can get made as a TV show. And we had a good interview with him a few months ago, and And I would look forward to working with him. He's really sharp.
Have you ever felt any urge to succumb to what I used to dub disparagingly hindline disease? No offense to his work, he was a brilliant man, but the idea to make all your stuff fit into one grand unified tapestry universe, you have never dealt with that, have you?
Actually, Heinlein, I never actually did that either. It was Isaac who was really one of the principals in that area, and helped by David Brin to some extent. But Heinlein had a timeline which was made up by John W. Campbell, who said it's fit together. And
I've seen the timeline.
Cool. So, but in science fiction, they love these timelines. They love these historical timelines, and so Heinlein is amenable to this sort of thing. His work is, but I'm not sure he actually wanted to do that completely.
Well, given the state of COVID we're in, we aren't doing, a lot of events in the store yet. Originally, I thought by this spring, like E Little U, I just had her first book out. I was going to have an event in the store with that. We did a little virtual thing, and I'm hoping by this fall we'll be able to do at least some kind of moderate or distance events in the store.
We'll have to wait and see, won't we?
But we're not there yet. It was really sad for me that the last Shannara, at least the end of the cycle, came out and we couldn't do an event with them. Have you figured out if you're going to make your stuff so that nobody can write prequels and sequels to it, or your future plans for down the...
I'm thinking I may or may not be retiring, but I'm thinking I might do a prequel to the Eon series, which would be 3 books set in the lost centuries. But the publishers rejected those books. They don't want to do that, or they severely underpaid them. So publishing is in a kind of confused state right now. Maybe readers are in a confused state as well. I don't know. But, if they're happy to give up on all of this, then I'm happy to be. I've had the career I've had, and I'm working on my memoirs, and we'll get that out, I hope, eventually. And that might be more sellable than my fiction.
I don't know. I mean, there have been authors, and I remember talking to Catherine Kramer years ago about authors who just have sort of outgrown the paradigm or shifted their audience, the people who had grown away or had passed away or quit reading had not been replaced by enough new people. And sometimes this does seem to shift. I don't know if it's shifting in genres, or I did talk to a handful of authors this previous year because I was curious what one had told me. And all the guys that were willing to actually give me this right answer told me they're making currently about half their money off audiobooks.
Yeah, and I'm making most of my money that I make off of electronic copies. And there are audiobooks, but actually we've retained the rights for most of my books. Kind of stopped by the time Darwin's Radio came out, but before that, we own those rights. So the electronic books sell pretty well. And my feeling is, if you can sell as many electronic books as you sell paperbacks back in the day, then you're probably going to do okay.
Well, we'll see where the trend goes. Right now, I know the ebook sales they kind of hit a plateau, I believe, and regular book sales are, I think, showing signs of picking back up we won't really get a good feel, I think, till next year sometime as to what number of people are willing to buy the hardcover, buy the paperback, want to listen to the book on Audible or whatever out there. Right. But right now things are just kind of a mess.
They are. But this all began around 2000, long before Amazon came onto the field. And it started with a sudden slump in the total numbers of books being sold, about 30% slump in around 2000, 2001. And that was astonishing. It was textbooks, it was across the board. And there was also this sudden slump in mass market paperbacks because the distributors were being sabotaged by something or other. And the distributors were being narrowed down to 1 or 2 per region. Whereas there used to be...
David Hartwell would give the lecture on that.
Yeah. Pardon?
David Hartwell was the lecturer on that. He blamed on Seattle, actually. It was the local guys had gone to Adams News and Safeway and all that and said, we want one person to deliver all our stores, not have these little trucks going around from 17 chains and stuff. And why might they work for them and damage the publishing?
Yeah, that was the heart of mass market paperbacks, which made huge inroads or made huge money for publishers. And of course, readers could get access to them because they were kept in chain stores, they were kept in drugstores, liquor stores, wherever you could find. As a kid, I could buy paperbacks of all different sorts in grocery stores and liquor stores, and that changed. And that was a sad thing. But also that meant publishing had to kind of regroup. and find itself again. And I got to say, one of Hartwell's stories that just really shocked me was when he said he was working with Arbor House publisher as an editor, and he had bought Neuromancer and Blood Music and a fair number of other books. And at one point, the publishers called him into their office and says, "I hear your division is doing quite well." And David said, "Thank you." And they said, "No, we don't want to be a science fiction publisher. We're closing you down. You're fired." Can you
Yeah,
imagine?
he and I had numerous talks and meals. And he told me all about that. He was not happy with them.
No, but I had never heard that story before on No WestCon here, one of our last times we talked with him. And, you know, that just shook me because that showed how stupid New York publishing can be. And, you know, we've got a lot of brilliant New York publishers, but there were a lot of instances where they weren't all that smart and they kind of doomed themselves. And that may be what we're facing now. Although I will say that working with HMH is great fun, and these people are really wonderful. Gave me a fabulous cover, and they know how to edit this book. So that's fun. And you know, also Tor Books, where I worked with for years, was one of my favorite publishers. Beth Meacham is now retiring. And
I just heard that. Yeah.
I've had a really good run in publishing, and I'll get, you know, going through the mass market paperbacks time, I did well in that time period. Eon came out in that time period and sold 1 million copies, you know, not only here, but in England. So
No.
did quite well. And I'm kind of happy to step back and let some of these other people survive and teach me how to publish a book today.
Got a couple questions in the question log I want to look at. So one of our fans you would recognize wants to know how the memoir is going and when you think it might actually be out.
I don't know. I haven't got a publisher for it yet. I got to finish it and I got to revise it. Right now, I'm going back and correcting stuff and trying to get the facts straight. And, you know, one of the things that's really helping me here is Wikipedia. So my memory may or may not be good, but I check it against Wikipedia.
Yeah, so I did get a laugh when a couple authors such as Misty Lackey told me they were using fan pages on Wikipedia to check their stuff.
That's right. That's right. Well, that's
Sorry. Another question here says, what was it like to be a part of the collaborative process with Delray for the new Jedi Order and with Rogue Planet serving as sort of the prequel?
Well, you know, the Star Wars people had a certain plan they wanted to follow through. They only wanted me to include a couple of characters and a couple of settings. But what I did was I created Zonoma Sakote, this planet that can sprout rocket engines and basically leave its solar system whenever it gets irritated. And Zonoma Sakote was used, I later learned, in 17 or 18 other Star Wars novels, which is kind of, you know, wonderful. And I wonder, I haven't read them all, but I wonder what they did with it. But, you know, creating that kind of stuff and then having people run with it, that's great fun. When I worked on the Halo series, that was also great fun because a lot of fans really wanted to do the origin story for the Forerunners. That was their favorite thing to think about at night. And there was a little concern that when I did it, and sometimes only with a little bit of help from the original creators, when I did it, that they would be resentful. Instead, the fans came forward and were very supportive of that whole thing and suddenly incorporated in their encyclopedias. And suddenly we were part of the canon. And that was an amazing experience. And so that was great fun.
I did find interesting when the whole Star Wars thing recently changed hands to basically Disney and such, and a lot of things that, you know, because it's gone through, or what was it? It was, I think it was Bantam had it and then Delray had it, or vice versa. And they'd switched, and of course the companies eventually merged. But what was canon before didn't become canon. And I remember one of our local authors, who I think is an awesome guy, Timothy Zahn, was ecstatic one day because they just put his character on the cartoon show, so it was now canon. So Thrawn was canon, and Tim was like, "Yes."
Yeah, there were a lot of complications when you end up with a character from your universe on a cartoon show. So we will tell stories about that, but only after a couple of drinks.
Okay. If anyone has any other questions, now is the time to put them in there because we're running out of time here. We only have about 5 minutes or so left here, and I don't want to have somebody complain they didn't get their question. So ask it now. Let me look at my other notes here and see what I haven't thought of yet here. We already kind of talked about that. Sorry, I got 3 pages of this here. Well, I guess we could talk. The question I held off on because it seems too trite. So how do you actually write a novel these days? Do you start with longhand? Do you start on the computer? How do you go back and forth on?
All done on the computer. I'm revising all the time, which is difficult to do in longhand, and or at least messy. And so I work on the computer, and I have ever since I owned my first computer. It fit perfectly. I'm a terrible typist, so I make a lot of mistakes, especially now as my fingers get older. But I can correct them pretty quickly.
Yeah, I remember Bill Gibson saying that he wrote his first big novel on a manual typewriter, which considered was Neuromancer. I thought was pretty darn funny. Well, here's the one you're gonna love. Someone wants to know what's your favorite book. I think they mean the ones you've written.
Uh, well, I gotta say, I'm kind of fond of this Unfinished Land book. This is an interesting book. I didn't feel like I wrote it, so I can actually reread it and think, did I do that? Did I write that? That's kind of novel. I don't know. I don't remember writing that. So I think my subconscious may be able to find some freshness in the book as I reread it. But other than that, there's so many books that I had great fun doing. Forge of God, City at the End of Time, Eon, Blood Music. All those books are among my favorites. I really like my fantasy novels though, because I can go back into being influenced by Jorge Luis Borges and Jack Vance and Paul Anderson and all those wonderful people and Tolkien, and just do my own thing and feel the freedom of borrowing without borrowing, just being inspired by it.
Well, this is new one to me. Someone wants to know if you're having any problems with Disney. Alan Dean Foster is apparently having issues with Disney.
Well, he is, but he's got a much bigger stake than I do. I only have one book, and I haven't. I don't know whether I'd get any royalties from that at all. But I wish him well, and I wish Disney to get smart, because they, which is the whole Halo series was also blanked out when they sold the publisher, sold the series to another publisher. The publisher realized that they had possibly a different contract, and they thought they could avoid paying royalties. Well, they found out they couldn't. Richard Curtis kind of persuaded them to pay royalties. So we're getting royalties on the Halo books now. And if that's the case, then I suspect Star Wars will soon follow, because that's precedent.
Yeah, I've seen various companies over the years. I probably shouldn't name them, do stupid things like that, where we have this contract that says we'll have to pay you royalties, but we don't feel like doing it anymore. I'm like, okay.
Yeah, well, you can get your backside sued off with all of that if you're not careful. And I think I belong to Writers Guild of America and West, and they negotiated some amazing stuff with all the people who were doing kind of shenanigans with with different versions of the agents' contracts and so on. And they were trying not to be strong advocates for their clients necessarily. And that's breach of fiduciary trust. And that I would be, as a lawyer, I would love to get interested in. So I think that's
sorry. On the positive side, one of the fans wants to know if you have any fond memories of your work with Delray and Lucasfilms.
Absolutely. Getting out to the ranch at LucasArts and visiting with them. I never actually got to meet Lucas, but going out there and seeing the artwork and the artifacts and stuff, that was fabulous.
Do you think the pandemic has affected your current, the book you just published, or anything you're working on for the future?
Well, the Unfinished Land was done before the pandemic and wasn't published before then, but the memoirs are incorporating bits and pieces of my reactions to the pandemic and to the idiocy surrounding our current political system. Donald Trump is going to be one of the most infamously stupid presidents we've ever known. And I'll say that and hope the people won't buy my book if they voted for Donald Trump, because that man is a crazy son of a bitch.
It's frightening to me how much his fan base still believes all the things they've told him, and the
Republican
Party is still going along.
Yeah, they're as crazy as he is, and that's very disturbing. It's like 40% of Americans are actually, blue bonkers. So we'll see if it's out. But, I think he might be looking at jail time soon. So let's hope so.
I probably shouldn't get that too much. My boss might get a call from but I tend to be fairly liberal. All my friends know that. I think we're about out of time. Anything else you'd like to say before we roll out?
No, it's been great fun. I'm glad to be able to do a sort of interventional signing here and sell more books for you guys, because you're one of my favorite bookstores.
Well, thank you. Thanks to all the attendees from coming. Keep in mind, you can buy books and get them signed off our website, and feel free to order something else and let us know anything else we should be doing. We're doing the best we can with the resources we have right now. Thank you, and everyone have a good night.
Thanks, guys. Good to see you.